Solo goes camping. Solo was very excited. Mum and Dad were apprehensive. Their children were horrified. What had caused this range of emotions was that Mum and Dad had announced that the entire family, including Solo the dog, were to go camping. Not only were they all going camping, they were to go camping not at a campsite park, but in some woods. No electricity, no phone, no running water. "We're going to be totally on our own for a few days," Dad had proudly announced to the entire family. While Mum and Dad had told their children that they were looking forward to going camping deep in some woods, in reality, Mum had her doubts. She knew her husband would have no problem camping in the dark, damp wood. After all, her husband enjoyed nothing more than playing golf in the worst weather possible. The more rainy, chilly, windy, and miserable the weather, the more Dad enjoyed playing golf. Mum warned Dad. She told him that she was up for the idea of getting the kids away from video games, cell phones, and computers for a while. However, she was not going to agree to go for a week. A whole week? With the kids and Solo in the woods? Can you imagine? She had shuddered at the very thought. So Dad had compromised. They would camp out in the woods for 2, possibly 3 days. That was it. Dad was disappointed. He couldn't see why his family was not as enthusiastic as he was. Being in the woods, no noise, no radio, no TV, back to nature. He was sure once they got there, his family would demand that they stay longer. Dad wasn't completely correct about all members of his family not wanting to go camping, even if for a short while. Dad had forgotten about Solo. He had heard Mum, Dad, and the kids discussing Dad's idea from his usual spot under the large kitchen table. Solo had listened as the kids complained bitterly about the prospect of even one night in the woods away from their electronics and their friends. But Mum was open to the idea of at least trying for 2 nights, while Dad had wanted a whole week. The idea of being forced to spend a week with their parents in the woods, away from their beloved computers and games, made the kids decide that perhaps 2 days wouldn't be so bad after all. So when Solo had heard Dad describe being in the woods, back to nature, and living in a tent, Solo decided this sounded like great fun. Not that Solo understood exactly what a tent was, or even camping, but if Dad was enthusiastic about the idea of camping, then Solo was enthusiastic also. Dad even went out and bought 3 new tents, one for Mum and Dad, and one each for the kids. Dad decided that they should all set up the tents on the rear lawn as a practice run. As these were very simple tents, it didn't take long for all 3 tents to be set up. Solo, of course, was fascinated by the whole thing. He watched as the kids put their tents up in half the time compared to Mum and Dad. Once the tents were up, Solo quite naturally had to investigate all 3. They were not very large. Each one could take no more than 2 sleeping bags, and a place for some clothes. Mum and the kids wondered how they would do with such small tents, even if it was for only 2 nights. Mum knew now she had made the right decision by telling Dad they wouldn't go for a whole week. A whole week, she thought, in those tiny tents? Dad told her that even 2 days in the tents would be character building for the kids. Mum wasn't sure how much character building would take place in only a few days, but she was very sure an entire week would be more character building than she could handle. "We won't be in them much anyway," said Dad. "We'll be near a lake. We can swim, take out my canoe. It'll be perfect." Mum raised an eyebrow at the word perfect and walked away, not saying another word. The other issue that needed deciding was where Solo would sleep. Mum had hoped that one of the kids would say Solo could sleep in their tent. After all, they only had one person in their tents, but the kids were adamant that Solo would not spend the night in their tents, which meant Solo would somehow have to cram into Mum and Dad's. Solo loved the idea of spending time in any of the tents. He still wasn't clear exactly what camping was, but it was beginning to sound like a lot of fun. Eventually, Dad was loading up the camping gear onto the roof of the SUV. He had also packed food, a small stove, drinks, and other essentials, including lightweight raincoats, just in case the weather turned on them. Then they set off. Dad was in high spirits, reminding his family that this would be an adventure they would remember for a long time. Solo was not relegated to the cargo area of the SUV this time, as the cargo area was full of the extra items the family had insisted on bringing along. Dad wondered what his wife's and kids' idea was for camping, as they seemed to have everything but the kitchen sink. Instead, Solo was allowed to sit in the back row of the car between the kids. This was awesome for Solo, but not for the kids. As we know, Solo is a large dog, and every time Dad made a turn, Solo would slide or lean into one of the kids, much to their annoyance. The kids got so fed up having the large, furry mass between them that they moved Solo next to the door. This way he could lean against the door instead of on both of them. Naturally, this meant Solo was directly next to the window, and it wasn't long before Solo decided he wanted to do what all dogs love to do, and that was stick his head out of the window as the car sped along. The trouble was, not one member of the family offered to lower the window for him, which meant he would have to let them know they needed to lower the window for him. So he lifted his head, took a deep breath, and began to bark his annoying "Pay attention to me" bark. Solo's "Pay attention to me" bark was highly effective for several reasons. Firstly, it was very loud. Secondly, it wasn't really a bark at all. It was more of a high-pitched whine combined with a bark. Solo barked directly into Dad's ear, making him jump and almost causing Dad to drive into a ditch. "Good heavens, Solo," he said. "Don't do that. You almost made me crash." Dad rubbed his ear, which was beginning to ring from the loudness of Solo's bark. But Solo didn't stop. He kept going. Despite the family shushing him and saying, "Be quiet, Solo," Solo didn't shush. In fact, Solo barked even louder, which inside the car echoed around and round, making it seem like there were 12 Solos in the car. The only member of the family not bothered by Solo's barking was the daughter. As Solo kept barking, she placed her headphones on so she could listen to music from her phone. She sat there, quite content, enjoying her music and chewing some gum, totally cut off from Solo's annoying bark. Solo's family was well aware what this particular type of bark meant. "Perhaps he needs to go to the bathroom," Mum said. "Perhaps he needs a walk," said her son. But it was Dad, determined to get to the campsite without delay, who figured it out. "Lower the window," he said. "I bet that'll do it." And you know what? It did. Suddenly, Solo was able to do something that he rarely had the chance to do: stick his head out of the window while Dad was driving. The wind was strong enough that Solo's eyes began to water. He didn't mind, though. With his teeth showing through his massive grin, Solo knew this was going to be the best camping trip ever. Drivers in other cars honked and waved to Solo and the family as they drove by. Eventually, though, Solo grew tired and decided it was time to take a nap. So he made his way back between the two children and, keeping his body on the rear seat, leaned forward, resting his head neatly on the armrest in the front between Mum and Dad. Mum marveled at Solo's ability to take a nap in the weirdest of positions. "Just look at you, Solo," she said. "How does he do that?" Hearing his name, Solo raised an eyebrow, but then deciding that raising an eyebrow used too much energy, he closed his eyes to take his nap. A few hours later, the family arrived at the edge of the woods. As Dad parked the car, he sighed. It suddenly dawned on him that his family had overpacked, and they might have to make more than one trip into the woods from where they parked. As the family struggled to get all their gear to their designated campsite next to the lake, Solo happily ran alongside the narrow path that led through the woods. If this was camping, then he was all for it. The smell of the woods, the sound of the insects, the feel of excitement as the family found their spot by the lake. It was worth the walk. Other campers were dotted around the edge of the lake, their tents reflecting in the bright sunshine. Solo's family dumped their camping gear on the bank of the lake and looked across the still water. Dad turned to Mum and, putting his arm around her shoulders, said, "This is going to be a very relaxing few days." For once, Mum agreed with her husband. Solo, quite naturally, wasn't content with simply staring at the water. Solo is a Labrador, and Labradors like to swim. Solo spied acres of still, fresh water and wanted to swim. Immediately, before anyone could stop him, Solo ran to the edge of the lake and jumped right in. His head kept neatly above the water as he paddled around for a few minutes. The kids were, of course, delighted by this. Mum and Dad, though, were worried about that night, when he slept in Mum and Dad's small tent. They wouldn't smell the clean, fresh smell of the woods. They would instead have the delightful stink of a large and very damp dog. But first, Solo had to shake most of the excess water off of himself, which is exactly what he did, catching the daughter totally unaware as she was looking at her phone, which she had been instructed not to do. Mum and Dad tried not to laugh as their daughter shrieked in exasperation. "It's all over my phone!" she screamed as she stormed off to sulk next to a tree. At least the weather was warm, almost uncomfortably so, to the point that once their tents had been finally set up and the canoe carried to the lake, all members of the family were sweating profusely. All that is except Solo, who, thanks to his damp fur, could lay on the ground and watch as the family set up their camp. And not for the first time, Solo marveled at humans' ability to make life so complicated. To him, all they needed to do was find the right spot by the lake, do a little circle, and then lay down. How hard could it be? Mum and Dad set up their small stove and cooked everyone a simple meal. Solo was fed his usual food, which he had to admit, for some reason, tasted better when eaten outside. Before bed, the family played games, including the kids throwing tennis balls into the lake to fetch. And as Solo was already wet, Mum and Dad were resigned to sleeping with a very smelly and damp dog. That night, most of the family slept very soundly indeed, except, that is, for Mum and Dad. When Solo slept, he would snore and wake up Mum and Dad. Normally they wouldn't hear Solo at home, as he tended to stay downstairs, unless there was a thunderstorm. So Mum and Dad didn't hear him snore. So it was a surprise to them that Solo snored at all. It wasn't a soft, gentle snore either. Solo's snore was a loud snore, with deep, loud intakes of breath, followed by a gush of air coming out with such force that Solo's lips would flutter. The other habit that Solo had at home was to wander around downstairs at night. Solo would always go to sleep on his bed under the large kitchen table, and in the morning that was where the family would find him. But during the night, if Solo woke up, he had a tendency to go on patrol. He would get up and walk around the downstairs of the house, checking each room, and often peering out of the windows into the dark just to see if he could see anything. Solo liked this time of night. He enjoyed the quiet, and he often wondered what was going on outside with the nighttime creatures that he couldn't see. The problem was that Solo couldn't go on patrol in a small tent. There was nowhere to patrol in the first place. The result was a restless Solo. He would get up, move around the small tent, and wake up Mum and Dad. There weren't even any windows for him to look out of. Once, he had heard an owl quite close by. He really wanted to go and say hello, but he couldn't figure out how to unzip the tent door. So he decided to bark hello instead, not only waking Mum and Dad with a jump, but annoying a neighbouring camper who shouted, "Would you please keep your dog quiet?" When Dad awoke early the next morning, he wondered why he was so hot. As he opened his groggy eyes, he understood. Solo had decided that the most comfortable place to sleep was not on the ground at Dad's feet, but actually on Dad. Solo's furry body acted like a blanket. When Dad finally focused, the first thing he saw was Solo's giant head smiling back at him as he rested on Dad's chest, looking directly into Dad's eyes. "Oh, Solo, get off. No wonder I was so hot." He pushed Solo off and directly onto Mum's head. "What the f*** got going on?" she asked as she struggled to breathe. Solo, finally getting the message, stood up, putting his full weight on Dad's stomach. "Ouch!" he said. Thinking quickly, he unzipped the tent and pushed Solo outside. "Thank goodness," said Mum. "I told you we should have got a cat," said Dad. Mum knew he didn't mean it. After all, it was Dad who had chosen Solo in the first place. Fortunately, Solo didn't hear Dad, as he had gone over to the nearest tree to relieve himself. After he had finished, he decided that camping was awesome. He couldn't understand why the family didn't do it more often. Amazingly, the rest of the family seemed to agree with Solo. Even Mum was coming around to the idea. Dad decided they should all go for a quick paddle in his new canoe. Dad was extremely proud of this purchase, and his plan was to take it out to fish at other times. The idea of being by himself in the middle of a lake with a few sandwiches and some hot coffee was very appealing indeed. He'd be away from any family drama and, of course, Solo. Today's trip was just to take the canoe out so everyone could enjoy. Dad's fishing would have to wait for another time. The canoe was large enough that even Solo got to come along. Solo was placed at the head of the boat where he could see everything. Dad rowed, Mum was next to Solo, and the kids were at the back. "Isn't this grand?" said Dad as he puffed to paddle them to the middle of the lake. His family had to agree. It was indeed grand. Well, for a few minutes anyway. Solo was the first to notice the change in the wind. His keen sense of smell had picked up something in the air. As he sat up, he sniffed the air. Like most creatures on Earth, Solo could sense when it might rain. And Solo could now sense that it would rain. Among the few creatures that seemed to be oblivious to potential rain were Solo's family. Dad kept rowing, and Mum and the kids continued to enjoy the ride. Only Solo was nervous. He noticed they were a long way from their campsite. In fact, they were directly in the middle of the lake. Even if they started back now, they still might get rained on. He decided to get everyone's attention, so he attempted to turn around. As has been explained before, Solo is not a small dog. Solo is, in fact, a big, heavy dog, and as he tried to turn around, he began to rock the boat. "Steady there, boy!" shouted Dad over his shoulder. "Dear," he said to his wife, "can you check and see what's up with Solo?" Mum, who was facing forwards, told Solo, "Sit." But Solo wanted to tell the family about the rain he just knew was going to start any moment. So he kept shifting his weight as he turned around, and now he was rocking the boat even more. All this commotion prevented Solo's family looking at the sky, which suddenly had become very dark. The kids screamed, Dad yelled, and Mum moved to get to Solo, which meant climbing over Dad. But in doing so, she managed to knock one of the oars out of Dad's hand, and it fell into the water and slowly started to float away. Dad leaned over in an attempt to reclaim the oar, just as Mum tried to turn around, which was not such a good idea after all. What happened next would go down in the family's history as the Great Canoe Catastrophe. The canoe rocked, first one way, then the other. Each time the top of the boat got closer and closer to the water. Dad yelled at everyone, "Don't move!" But it was too late. The canoe leaned just a few inches too far one way, then the other, and tipped over, throwing Mum, Dad, the kids, and Solo into the water, which they hadn't realized until now was very cold. No sooner had the family hit the water than the rain that Solo had predicted was upon them. A hard, driving rain, accompanied by a strong gust of wind. Remarkably, through all this, the canoe itself had not capsized, and Dad was able to climb back in and pull Mum and the kids back on board. They now looked for Solo. In a panic, they wondered if he had been swept away. But then Dad noticed Solo swimming slowly but steadily back to their camp. Solo had decided he had had quite enough of canoeing. In fact, he was beginning to think that camping itself wasn't that much fun either. So he felt swimming to shore was a safer idea than getting back in Dad's canoe. As he paddled back to their campsite, he heard Dad and Mum yelling after him. He could see they were back in the canoe, paddling furiously to catch up, but Solo wasn't interested. When he made it to shore, he did an almighty shake, which didn't have much effect as the rain was still beating down, then pushed open the flap to Mum and Dad's tent, and, seeing Dad's sleeping bag half open, climbed in, making it quite wet. Then he fell into a deep sleep. That is how Mum and Dad found Solo, sound asleep, half in, half out of Dad's sleeping bag, water still dripping from his body. Dad was soaking wet. He knew the kids would never, ever, ever, ever get back in the canoe again. Solo had made his sleeping bag almost as wet as Solo, So he made a wise decision. They would leave right now and never talk about this camping trip again. On the way home, Solo was once again allowed in the rear seats with the kids, but this time Solo was too tired to bark, so that the family would lower a window for him. Instead, sitting directly behind Dad, Solo rested his head on the back of Dad's seat. Solo was feeling a little guilty, as perhaps he was the cause of the canoe throwing the family overboard. So by leaning forward, his mouth could just reach Dad's ear. Solo stuck out his massive tongue and gave Dad's ear a big, wet lick, as a sign that he was sorry for any trouble he may have caused. Taking one hand off the steering wheel, Dad leaned back over his shoulder and rubbed the top of Solo's head. And even though Solo could feel Dad's still wet shirt, Solo knew that whatever had happened, he was forgiven. So as he closed his eyes and let the rocking motion of the car lull him to sleep, he knew all was right with the world.